On this episode of Newt's World, on Sunday, May 19th, a helicopter crashed and killed Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian. They were traveling from Iran's border with Azerbaijan after inaugurating a dam project when their helicopter went down in a mountainous area near the city of Yafa. The U.S. State Department in a press briefing said, quote, "We have been quite clear that Ebrahim Raisi was a brutal participant in the repression of the Iranian people for nearly 4 decades. Some of the world's worst human rights abuses occurred during his tenure as president, especially the human rights abuses against the women and girls of Iran. So what is next for Iran? And what impact will Iran's future have on the Middle East?" I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
My pleasure.
Let me start by just asking about your own background. How did you end up studying all this?
So I was born in Iran in the mid-1970s. My father was a university professor who ended up jailed twice during the time of the Shah, simply for having expressed some criticism against the Shah. And then later on, before the revolution, my family fled to Sweden. No one knew exactly what was going to happen in the country. My father had an opportunity to be a guest scholar at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. So he took that opportunity after coming out of jail the second time. While we're there, the revolution happens. It takes an Islamic turn. And my dad's name is actually put on the list of folks that would be executed on the spot if he returned, accusing him of having been a collaborator with the Shah's Secret Service, which was not true. He had been tortured by them. My dad does go back, however, to clear his name in order to avoid the revolutionaries executing a family member instead, which unfortunately was a common thing at the time. And he ends up being jailed again, a third time, but this time in the Ayatollah's jail, but does manage to get out of that thanks to the fact that the people running the jail were actually 20-year-olds, many of them his former students, and knew of his criticism of the Shah. He got out. He's never been back since. I grew up in Sweden. I was four and a half when this happened. So it was quite a bit of a trauma. And I think it shaped my interest in politics and what was happening around the world, but particularly, of course, in Iran. And then I studied it at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I wrote my dissertation on Israeli-Iranian relations under Francis Fukuyama.
Which is in itself could be an entire topic. I mean, the complexity of that dance is kind of remarkable. Let's go back to the immediate event that sort of attracted attention. What do we think that we know about the helicopter crash itself?
Well, we do know that there were 3 helicopters that left pretty much at the same time, that the weather was pretty okay at the time of them leaving, but then it got really bad. 2 of the helicopters made it. The one with the president and the foreign minister and a few others did not. It crashed under very bad weather conditions, and the rescue workers could not even locate it for almost a day. By the time they got there were no survivors. I think at this point, it's not entirely clear whether everyone died as a result of the crash or whether they died during the freezing night in the storm. At least one person seems to have survived the crash initially, but died later on. Whether that was also true for the president or the foreign minister is not entirely clear. The government insists that there was no foul play, that there was not an assassination, but rather an accident. I think a lot of evidence points in that direction, but we should also be clear on the fact that the government actually has an interest in downplaying any rumors or speculation that it may have been foul play, because particularly if it would lead to or point the finger towards Israel, which otherwise, the Iranian government would be happy to blame, under the current circumstances, after they had an exchange of fire just a month ago in which the Iranians assert that they restored their deterrence against Israel, if it turns out that the Israelis actually were behind this attack, which again, there's no evidence for, that would mean that Iran's effort to restore deterrence was an utter failure, because the Israelis then escalated by taking out the president and the foreign minister. This would be deeply embarrassing for the government. It would also put the government in a position in which they would have to do something about it, which they clearly do not want to do. So I think while there is no evidence at this point, at least convincing evidence that there was any foul play, we should also be clear that this time around the government has an interest in playing down any speculation about foul play rather than playing it up, which is perhaps the reverse case under normal circumstances.
But of course, if I understand it correctly, this was a 45-year-old helicopter.
It was an American helicopter bought by the Iranians towards the end of the Shah's reign. Most of Iran's fleet are old American helicopters and airplanes. And because of US sanctions, they have not been able to service them. This is part of the reason why the Iranians have probably the highest rate of plane crashes. As part of the Iran nuclear deal, Boeing was actually supposed to service those planes. But Boeing, as I understand it, made a trip to Iran in the midst of those talks, looked at the planes and decided that it refused to do so. Because if it serviced those planes, it would be liable for whether they would crash. And it was not willing to take that risk because the planes were in such a bad shape.
So they're flying the number 2 guy in the country around in a 45-year-old plane with bad spare parts.
They're flying everyone around with those circumstances, not just the number 2 guy.
Now, I think it's helpful because it's complicated for Americans. The president's actually not the top person. The top person is the supreme leader, who is always, I guess, an Ayatollah by definition, because it's a religious theocracy. But can you walk through a little bit of that?
Given the fact that his title is supreme, perhaps it shouldn't be that difficult for us to understand that he is the top guy. But they have a system in which they do have a president. And at times, I think in Washington, we have tried to downplay the role of the president as if he has no influence at all. I think that is an exaggeration. I think you're absolutely correct. The president is not the top person. The supreme leader clearly is. But the presidents have actually at times been very decisive. If you take a look at Mohammad Khatami, the reformist president, who constantly clashed with the supreme leader, but not with the same ferocity, for instance, that Ahmadinejad did later on. And then you had Rouhani coming afterwards, who tried to work with the supreme leader, but it was very much thanks to Rouhani that the Iranians really went in the direction of nuclear negotiations with the United States. So take the presidents out of the picture and you would actually see that they actually did have an impact, but they don't have the decisive impact or the ultimate impact as the supreme leader does, because at the end of the day, at most, they're number 2. In the case of Raisi, however, I think we have to be clear that he had very little impact by design. He was the pick of the supreme leader because the supreme leader did not want to have another president with a will of his own, with an agenda of his own, with a mind of his own. He wanted a pliant conservative. And that's what he got in Raisi. That's why it's really difficult to pinpoint any particular policy as of late in which he was the driving force of it, and that without him, those policies would not have been pursued. For instance, if you put a hypothetical in front of us and say that, what if Rouhani, the previous president, had died in a helicopter crash? I think that would very likely have ended the nuclear negotiations because it was a critical force behind that. But there is no policy you can point to in which you can say, because Raisi is now out of the picture, that policy will no longer continue.
Is the Ayatollah Khomeini committed to getting nuclear weapons and therefore opposed to negotiations? What was the tension between the two?
The tension is not necessarily whether Khamenei wants to get nuclear weapons or Rouhani didn't. In fact, this will probably be quite surprising to American ears, but a lot of people in Iran right now view Khamenei as being the main obstacle for them weaponizing their nuclear program. There's a very strong growing group of people there who believe that with Trump walking out of the nuclear deal, Biden failing to go back in it, and Iran still having all of those sanctions on it, and given a new geopolitical situation in which the United States is tied up in Gaza, tied up in Ukraine, tied up in Taiwan, Iran actually should weaponize. But the person that is the biggest obstacle to that in this assessment is actually Khamenei himself, who strongly opposes weaponization. I think the Iranians really pursued a nuclear program as a bargaining chip with the United States. They need the energy aspect of it, and that program was already started under the time of the Shah. But the actual weaponization, as a comparison, the Pakistanis went from nothing to a nuclear weapon in 9.5 years. The Iranians have had a nuclear program since 1968, much thanks to the United States, Atoms for Peace program, and the efforts by Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in the 1970s to sell Iran Westinghouse reactors. If the Iranians really wanted, really were committed to a nuclear weapon in the same way as the Pakistanis were, in which they said, we rather eat grass, but we will have a nuclear weapon. One has to explain how come they've managed to have a nuclear program since 1968 and still not weaponized it. So I think their calculations are more complex. It doesn't mean that there aren't people there that don't want it. It doesn't mean that there aren't factors that may not push them towards getting it in a very bad scenario, in my view. But it's more complex than thinking that they're dead set on getting it, and that the only thing that could stop them is just making sure that they don't have access to uranium, et cetera, et cetera.
For the purpose of a limited program, they have more than enough access, don't they?
At this point, following Trump leaving the Iran nuclear deal, during the nuclear deal, the Iranians never had above 300 kilos of low-enriched uranium on their own soil. That was part of the deal. In fact, they kept themselves below 250. They need 1,200 kilos of low-enriched uranium that they need to re-enrich several times all the way above 90% to be able to have enough material for one bomb. And that's assuming that everything goes well, which at the first run, it probably won't. Now they have several thousands, not only of low-enriched uranium, they have 20% enriched uranium, and they have also now a small but very crucial stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. So they're much closer to having the material for a weapon than they were during the JCPOA. During the JCPOA, they would never be closer than a full year away from having the material for a nuclear weapon, with a combination of several different factors. Currently, the assessment of the U.S. intelligence, at least what is out publicly known, is that they are about 8 days away. If they make a decision to have the material for a bomb, the ready material for the bomb, they'll have it in 8 days.
Wow, which is virtually nothing.
Virtually nothing. Now, of course, having the material and having a bomb is two different things. They would probably still be a year to 2 years away from having a bomb once they have the material, which is only 8 days away. But it is nevertheless a very concerning situation. And one, frankly, and you and I may disagree on it, but we would not be in this situation if the JCPOA was in place.
I don't know enough to be authoritative, but I gather that you believe that they would have deliberately followed a very limited program and would have been willing to be held accountable.
Well, for the 2.5 years or so that the U.S. was in the deal, they lived up to the agreement fully. For another 11 or so months after Trump left, they still stuck to the deal. And after that, they started to violate key provisions of the deal, such as the stockpile, the level of enrichment, etc. But there were 14 reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is essentially the referee on this. 14 consecutive reports that stated that the Iranians are living up to all of the provisions of the deal. Twice did even the Trump administration certified, the Trump administration State Department certified that the Iranians were sticking to the deal. We will never know, of course, whether they would have done so indefinitely. But the track record in the beginning was actually a very promising one, and perhaps surprised a lot of people in Washington who thought that they would never live up to it. If they had violated it without the US having first left, given the level of inspections, we would have found out within 24 hours. And we would have had the majority, vast majority, probably including the P5, on our side in terms of repercussions for the Iranians if they violated the deal. That was a key reason as to why I think they lived up to the deal as well.
Given their hesitation and given the almost 60-year track record of not quite getting there, how do you think their own thinking is evolving in terms of, if it's not a bargaining chip, what does it become?
That's a great question, because that is kind of the situation they're in right now. I think they need a nuclear program. Put yourself in their shoes. They have all of this gas and they have all of this oil, but they're running out of oil. Because of sanctions also, they cannot sell oil to a lot of different places. We have been telling a lot of other countries, you got to think about your future once the oil runs out, and you need to make sure that you have an economy that can stand. This is what the Shah started in 1968. He wanted to make sure that he would sell the oil and the gas externally and then use nuclear energy internally. Makes a lot of financial and energy security sense. So just as much as we don't want to be dependent on oil, the Iranians, if they are in a position to be able to avoid that, it is logical for them to avoid that. Now, on top of that, because of the fact that they did experiment with things that are much closer to weaponization, and they lost the confidence of the international community, they did not live up to all of the aspects of the NPT. They were put under sanctions. And then the JCPOA negotiation was essentially a negotiated period in which they would have to prove their positive, non-desire to go in the military direction before all sanctions could be fully lifted. They ended up using the nuclear escalation as a counter to US's sanctions escalation. Just as much as we view the sanctions as our leverage in that negotiation, they view the number of centrifuges, the stockpile, as part of their leverage in the negotiation. But what's the value of that if there isn't a negotiation? What's the value of that if you are in the current position they're in which they believe, rightly or wrongly, that the US is incapable of providing sustained sanctions relief to Iran? Because of domestic political reasons here in the United States, even if a president signs a deal, the next one will tear it up. And as a result, the US cannot provide sustain. That means that suddenly a deal with the US is no longer particularly attractive. And then you're sitting on all of this leverage that you cannot use. And that's part of the reason why I think for the last year, you're seeing that the growth in their program has kind of started to taper off. Because what's the point of getting that close to a bomb if you're not going to weaponize and you're not going to be able to use it as a leverage? In fact, if you get too close to a bomb, you actually undermine your own leverage if there is a future negotiation. Because the United States is likely not going to negotiate with you if you have that much leverage. It's a calibration that is very imprecise. It depends not just on how much they do, but also what the thinking and calculations and political outlook is here in the United States with future presidents. So in some ways, they're stuck with a nuclear program. It's larger than it should be, larger what they need it to be, not large enough for them to actually have a bomb. And again, we can go into why there actually would be a lot of negatives for them to have a bomb, but also perhaps too large to be able to be used as that leverage as they initially thought. Because take a look at one thing that I think is really fascinating. Back in the Obama days, the Iranians were approaching 1,500 kilos of LEU. And the media here was talking about it as if they were reaching some sort of point of no return, as if they were about to get a nuclear weapon. They have tens of thousands of kilos of it now, of higher enriched uranium, not tens of thousands of the higher enriched, but they have so much enriched uranium now that they're much, much closer to it. And we're almost not talking about it at all. So suddenly, if they were using it as a scarecrow to get negotiations and have leverage in the negotiation, it is not particularly effective right now.
Given all this sort of tension about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, how does the death of President Raisi affect all that? And What will the circumstances be in which they pick a successor?
So, on the first part of your question, because Raisi was not decisive on this file, it does not have an impact on that file directly. This is not affecting Iran's nuclear policy. However, because of what his death may mean for the future broader trajectory of Iran, internally and externally, it may end up having an effect on the nuclear program, depending on who comes next. Much indicates that Khamenei wanted Raisi to be the next supreme leader, and that there was a lot of conservative backing for that. There were other contenders as well. Now that is not going to happen. Now they also have to pick a new president. The population, by and large, have stopped participating in the elections because they have lost faith that change can come through the ballot box. This loss of faith is directly related to the fact that the conservatives have increasingly disallowed non-conservatives to even run. In the last election when Raisi was running, it was just a few conservatives and one token reformist that was allowed to run. And election participation dropped to 47%. Whereas in previous elections, the Iranians had participation rate in the presidential elections between 75 and 80%. That's a dramatic loss because people lost faith in that. In the parliamentary elections that were held just a few weeks ago, participation was 42% nationwide, 7% in Tehran, 7%. And it tells you something about, people don't think it matters any longer, and they've given up on that. And that's, again, because they were not offered real choices. Now, there's some pressure from conservatives, and as well as from others, of course, that they have to allow a much more broader set of candidates to participate. I personally don't think that is likely to happen. I think what you may end up seeing is that it will be broader in the sense that there will be viable moderate conservatives and viable hardline conservatives. But that is the spectrum. In the last election, it was just hardline conservatives, not even moderate conservatives, which I don't know if that will be enough to generate any enthusiasm in the public to think that they actually have a real choice. It may. Even in 2013, by the way, there was almost no energy in the presidential campaign until the last 7 to 10 days. Then suddenly something changed. And Rouhani, who most people didn't think that much of, suddenly managed to get a tremendous amount of support just in the last couple of days. Something similar could potentially happen, but we simply don't know. But if that happened, let's say that you actually do have a bit of a shakeup and you get at least some moderate conservatives in, it could have an impact because right now Iran has gone deep into the direction of allying itself with Russia and China. And while there is strong support for that amongst conservatives, there are also others who believe that closing the door entirely on the West may not be the smartest thing to do. Back when you were in Congress, Mr. Speaker, I remember the debate that was held in the United States about the sanctions that the Clinton administration imposed on Iran, the executive orders 94, 95. Some of the arguments in the debate then, not much of a debate, but a couple of editorials that were written about it, warned that if we went down that path of just sanctioning Iran, eventually we would push Iran into the arms of Russia and China. That may not at the time have been a very effective argument because Russia and China were not at all what they are today. But I think roughly 30 years later, we can see that that argument actually proved to be entirely true.
You do now have sort of a de facto alliance.
Well, de facto is the key word there because there is no treaty alliance between them, but they are acting as allies. And they're acting as allies largely because of an opposition to the United States or a US-led order. For instance, I do not personally believe that the Iranians would be so deeply supporting Russia in Ukraine if the JCPOA was still alive, because they would actually have had something to lose. At this point, at least their calculation is that they don't have much to lose. There's no trade with the US. There's no trade with Europe. The Europeans stopped buying Iranian oil, gas, nothing. even when the JCPOA was still technically in place, but Trump was there, they stopped those sales. So the only purchases of Iranian oil at this point is essentially China. And the Ukraine war gave the Iranians opportunities to strengthen their ties with Russia. So as much as this is a regime that has a tremendous amount of ideological facades, and, I'm not dismissing that their ideology is important, it is also very realpolitik oriented. And realpolitik, given the circumstances that they have right now, has pushed them in this direction. A direction I don't think necessarily would have been their choice.
Explain the realpolitik of their support for the Houthis and the Hezbollah and Hamas, and their continuous support for firing missiles at American bases and American ships. I mean, at one level, that's pretty aggressive.
Certainly. So we do need to differentiate a little between these different organizations. Hezbollah is, of course, the closest partner Iran has. The Iranians played a key role in creating Hezbollah in 1982. This was primarily born out of the fact that when the Iranians had their revolution in 1979 and the revolutionary government took over, like many other revolutionary governments, their number one agenda point was to spread their revolution. So Iran in the 1980s was this regime change-oriented country. It wanted to overthrow particularly the monarchies in the region. And it had next to zero success, of course. The only area in which it had some success was countries with large Shia minorities or majorities. Lebanon, of course, is one of them. And the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah or with Lebanon, of course, goes back centuries because of the Shia ties. And Iran invested in that. They did the same thing in Bahrain, but, utterly unsuccessful. They did the same thing in Iraq, and that was unsuccessful until the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein. And it turned out that the very Shia politicians and movements that Iran had invested in for decades became the winners of that war. But with Hezbollah, it's a very, very tight relationship, and it started off with their desire to spread their revolution, which ultimately, of course, was unsuccessful, but ended up becoming a strong partner with Iran. Relationship with Houthis is much, much newer. It's no more than 10, 15 years old. And it became partly as a result of Iran's rivalry with Saudi Arabia, in which the Saudis have been supporting Baluchi separatists in Iran's Baluchistan region, including Al-Qaeda-related organizations there, and the Iranians invested in the Houthis. What's very different between them and the Houthis, and I think this is between Houthis and Hezbollah would never act in two areas without clear coordination with Iran. Any major attack, escalation on Israel, and any major attack on the United States. The Houthis, however, do their own thing. They publicly criticize Iran. They claim that Iran is not being tough enough against Israel. And U.S. intelligence has picked up several times that the Iranians are telling the Houthis to do X or not do X, and the Houthis do it anyways. So they're a very independent organization. And again, it goes back to the fact that this is a much newer relationship. It's not at all with the same depth as you have with Hezbollah. I frankly don't think, even if the Iranians really, really wanted to press the Houthis to stop the attacks against ships in the Red Sea, that the Houthis would actually listen to Iran on that front. Hezbollah is a different story. Hamas is also a different story. Iran and Hamas's relationship was actually very negative from the outset. Hamas comes out of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, a very strong Sunni fundamentalist organization that had a very negative view of Shia and of Shia Iran. Moreover, Hamas supported Saddam Hussein in Saddam Hussein's war with Iran in the 1980s. The only thing that actually brought Hamas and Iran closer together was the peace process, the Oslo process, in which both Hamas as a rejectionist organization and Iran would be left out, and they saw it as a threat to their own power. That brought them together, but it's been a tense relationship, and they had many fallouts. One of the major fallouts that they had were over the war in Syria, in which Iran was supporting Assad and Hamas was supporting the opposition, because the core of the opposition in Syria was coming from the Brotherhood as well, from the Muslim Brotherhood as well. They only made up a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2017 and 2018. What Iran has done with these organizations, however, is that they have armed and trained them. Part of the reason why they're much, much more effective fighting forces and much more technologically advanced with major missiles and other forms of weaponry is thanks to the support that the Iranians have provided at very, very low cost compared to many other types of operations that could have taken place. What is binding them all together ultimately is that they don't want to see a Middle East that is dominated by the United States or Israel. So this is why they're calling themselves the Resistance Front. They're resisting U.S. domination in the region, Israel's occupation of Palestine. And what's also fascinating in all of this is increasingly in Washington, there's also been this thinking that, hold on, what is the value of us dominating the Middle East anyways? If, for instance, many in Washington believe that China is the real challenge, why are we continuing to waste a lot of energy trying to dominate the Middle East? It's an interesting dynamic in which at times I find actually the US side being far more confused about what its actual strategic objectives are than the Resistance Front. The Resistance Front has a very clear idea what their strategic objectives are.
I think that is a very mild critique of the level of confusion which Washington currently has. It suggests an orderly dialogue that doesn't currently exist. One of the questions I've always tried to ask people who know a great deal more than I do about Iran, when the Iranian parliament chants death to Israel and death to America, how are we supposed to interpret that?
On the one hand, it is a clear declaration of hostile intent, and we should not belittle that or take it lightly. On the other hand, we should also not pursue a foreign policy based on what slogans others use. We should follow a foreign policy that is based on our interest and make sure that we're maximizing our interests and not let the other side decide what we do by deciding to do the opposite of what they want. And I think oftentimes we have ended up in the latter category. We're reacting. Someone doesn't like us in the Middle East, so we're opposing them without actually questioning, should we be there? Do we have an interest here? Are we sacrificing American lives for something that actually is of particular value to us? Is this a vital interest? Those are the core questions that I think are rarely being asked in Washington. Instead, we're being very reactive. And it's easy to be reactive. You know, the Houthis chant death to America as well. But what is reality? Reality is that before the Saudi invasion of attack on Yemen, guess who our de facto partners were in Yemen against Al-Qaeda? It was the Houthis. The Houthis was the strongest force against Al-Qaeda. And reality is this. The Houthis had never attacked the United States. Now, they may have shot at some ships at this point, but back then, they had never attacked the United States. They were focused on their interest in Yemen, and they wanted to get Al-Qaeda out. Al-Qaeda killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Al-Qaeda attacked our embassies in Africa. We ended up siding with the Saudis, beating up the Houthis, and setting aside the ones that actually, beyond slogans, actually killed Americans. That's why I think your question is a good one, because we have to get into the space in which we're not basing our foreign policy on the slogans of others.
You have a very subtle and sophisticated knowledge of the region. And I'd like to invite you to think about maybe doing a podcast sometime where we sort of just put up a mental map of the region and go through all the different people who hate and try to kill each other for reasons that have nothing to do with the United States or the West. Some of them are 800 or 1,000-year-old inheritance. Others are personality. Others are geographic. And, you know, in a place like Iraq or Syria, the number of threads of hostility and of self-identity and of self-interest that are so astonishingly complex. And we try to summarize them all for 3 minutes on the evening TV.
You're absolutely right. That would be an interesting exercise. Just let me know when you want to do it. But I think the final outcome of that, if we were to just cut to the chase, is to conclude that we really have committed a major mistake by entangling ourselves in conflicts that have nothing to do with us, that do not touch our interests. It doesn't matter to us who is in control in this or that government. We don't need to have that level of influence or control over a region whose strategic significance has significantly dropped in the last 40 years because the importance of oil is not at all what it was 40 years ago. The United States is self-reliant, self-sufficient on oil at this point. Doesn't mean that oil isn't important. It certainly will be in the future as well, but not to the point in which we need to entangle ourselves in everyone else's conflict and make their conflicts our conflicts. And that's the part that I think at a minimum we have to stop trying.
As you know, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is now 85, the longest serving head of the state in the Middle East, and at least by some reports in declining health. What do you think happens in terms of his successor?
So the secession in Iran is going to be probably the most important event in the Islamic Republic's history. The first one was, of course, after Khomeini died in 1989. That was obviously extremely challenging for them, given that Khomeini essentially, in their view, had reached the status of an imam, essentially a prophet. But the second secession in some ways may be trickier because the type of uniting all authoritative person that Khomeini was for that system, Khamenei has failed to be. So the system is much more divided, much more at its own throat than it was in 1989. So this is going to be the biggest challenge. This is part of the reason why I think Khamenei himself had settled for Raisi, because he was an uncontroversial figure. And it would be easier for most factions to probably find something acceptable with him. And they wanted everything to be under control. That's part of the reason why I personally am skeptical that at least the leading faction in Iran had anything to do with his death, because this has been a big blow to them. The next person, of course, another reason as to why it's so important, he's likely going to live another 30, 40 years, which is kind of similar to the situation you have with Saudi Arabia. This is part of the reason why MBS, there's a lot of stake with MBS because he's going to be king for 40 years. All of the other kings that have come in Saudi Arabia for the last 20 years were very old when they became king. And as a result, no one expected him to last more than 5 to 10 years. With MBS, he's going to last 40 years, if not more. Unless, of course, he gets killed by someone. Same is true for the next supreme leader of Iran. So he can really set the direction of Iran in a very, very decisive way. Much more important than these presidential elections. This, of course, all assumes that the regime survives, that there isn't an overthrow of it, which, of course, absolutely can happen, given how tremendously unpopular the government is, the regime as a whole is.
When you said only 7% of Tehran had voted, if I were in power, that would strike me as a very ominous indication of unhappiness.
Particularly mindful of the fact that the government or the regime as a whole often pointed to very high participation rates in the elections as a sign of their legitimacy. And now they have the opposite. I think the reason why they impose it right now is because they want to get through the secession and then try to rebuild whatever idea of legitimacy they have. But the secession is so crucial for them, they actually want the people to be out of the equation.
Fascinating. I want to thank you for joining me. This turned out to be a very interesting conversation. And I want to mention to our listeners that they can find more details on your website for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft at quincyinstitute.org. That's quincyinst.org. And I really appreciate, Trita, your taking this time to be with me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Anytime.
Thank you to my guest, Trita Parsi. You can learn more about Iran and their upcoming elections on our show page at newsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.